Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Today I'm going to talk about a sutta that is very, very popular in the West, and you'll see why. Um, it's in the Numerical Discourses, the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 3, the Book of Threes, and it's sutta number 65. And it's usually referred to as the Kalama Sutta, because the Buddha is having an exchange, a discussion with the Kalamas. That it's a people, and the town is Kesaputta. And so the actual name of the sutta is the Kesaputta Sutta. But here in the West, because it's referred to so often, we just mostly know of it as the Kalama Sutta. And this sutta has some similarities with another sutta in the middle length discourses, sutta number 60. And it's a similar scenario where the Buddha is going to a town, and this town is on the edge of a forest. And because of that, the people of the town have all kinds of experiences with different religious leaders, different sadhus. They're still called sadhus in India. Uh, Sadhu is faith. So different people of faith that would go to the town. They would spend time in the forest meditating and having seclusion, and then come back to the town. And so that's the setting. And early on in the sutta, the Kalamas, and the Buddha's another one. Here's another person of faith. But he has quite a good reputation, and so the Kalamas actually approach him, and they say, Bhante, there are some ascetics and Brahmins who come to Kesaputta, come to our town. They explain and elucidate their own doctrines, but disparage, denigrate, deride, and denounce the doctrines of others. But then there are these other ascetics and Brahmins that come to Kesaputta, and they too explain and elucidate their own doctrines, but disparage, denigrate, deride, and denounce the doctrines of others. We're perplexed and in doubt, Bhante, as to which of these good ascetics speak truth and which speak falsehood. So that's the setting. And um, the answer the Buddha gives is very different than what they had been experiencing, because he doesn't just launch in to his doctrine. He gives them something very practical. But before we jump into that, I just want to talk about what a remarkable time in history it was when the Buddha was on the earth. And there's a German philosopher that he actually didn't first notice this. It was noticed in the 1800s, but this is the philosopher that usually gets credited with coining this, noticing this remarkable thing in history, that there was a powerful and somewhat overlapping, similar movement of thought across vast regions that had no communication with one another. In Persia, in the Greco-Roman world, certainly in China, in the Middle East. You had the Buddha, Confucius, Lao Tzu, You had Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. They were all alive within a very short period. Um, and so this German philosopher, Karl Jasper, he wrote a book. It was in German, obviously, but he's coined it the axial age. This idea of axle and this idea of a turning to something quite new, a real move away from the tribal thought to something that's quite much more altruistic and much more expansive. Um, and this axial age, it was during a liminal period. A period of liminal is from the Latin limen, meaning threshold. A liminal period in history is a time when old structures, old systems are collapsing, and yet new ones haven't fully emerged. And I think that this sutta is very rich because, I mean, there's ways that we are living very much in a liminal age where we're seeing collapses of some things, and so it's a time of great uncertainty. And the Buddha has a lot to give us during this time. I mean, always he does, but especially during this time. And something that we are experiencing in our current in our modern day is a lot this uncertainty that is a fertile ground for extremism. It's a fertile ground for polarization. There's a whole body of research called terror management theory, TMT. And it's very clear that when people have a hint or a reminder or it's in the room, their immortality, death. And you can expound to that, the fear of death and just the fear of uncertainty, that this feeling of unsure, unsure, unsure can is a fertile ground for people grabbing onto things and becoming more set, more set in their ways. The terror management theory hypothesizes that when people are um, reminded of their immortality, that they try to grab onto something that they think is bigger than them and more lasting. So all the isms, you know, all the isms, all the ideology that's got this certainty appeal, like, oh, this is right and all that's wrong, which is the setting here. My doctrine is right and all those other doctrines are false. That's the setting. So now we'll launch into what the Buddha has to say, which is extremely realistic and extremely practical. And the first thing he says, his first response to them, like, we're perplexed and in doubt, Bhante, as to which of these good ascetics speak truth and which speak falsehood. And the Buddha says, it's fitting. It's fitting for you to be perplexed. It's fitting for you to be perplexed, Kalamas, fitting for you to be in doubt. Doubt has arisen in you about a perplexing matter. He's so realistic, How would you know? Of course you're in doubt. Of course you're perplexed. That's actually appropriate. This is so wonderful when the Buddha, he just understands the human condition so well, and it's comforting. And then in typical of the Buddha, so many of the suttas, so often the Buddha is telling us what not to do, and then he will tell us what to do. And that's what he does here. Come, Kalamas, do not, do not go by oral tradition, by lineage of teaching, by hearsay, by a collection of scriptures, by logical reasoning, by inferential reasoning, by reasoned cogitation, by the acceptance of a view after pondering it, by the seeming competence of a speaker, or because you think this aesthetic is our guru. There's there's 10 things here, but you can lump them. So the first four really are, don't go by oral tradition, by lineage of teaching, by hearsay, by a collection of scriptures. It's astounding. Here we have in the Buddhist scriptures, the Buddha saying, you can't just go by the scriptures, you know? Um, it's not like this word of the God, word of God, where you're just supposed to accept it. But the whole Dhamma is, we chanted it like, come and see, investigate, find out for yourself, and it's something that you can experience individually for yourself. It's an experiential exploration. And so this whole idea of, sometimes, yeah, our thinking isn't all the way thought through. Just because something's very old, and people have always done it that way, it's still worth investigating. There's a silly story about um, uh, a caregiver, a parent teaching their child how to cook this turkey. Yeah. You know this story. Yeah.
Yeah, I know it as a ham.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um and so the parent is explaining to the child, okay, and then you cut off this section at the end. And the child is, well, why? Well, this is what I was taught. This is how back in the day, this is how my mother taught me. And so then the child runs out to ask the mother, why? Why are we cutting off that? And the grandmother's like, well, we had a small oven and invariably it wouldn't fit. Tradition, it's worth investigating and examining. And the Buddha's saying, don't go by oral tradition. There needs to be more. And then the second group is by logical reasoning, by inferential reasoning, by reasoned cogitation, by the acceptance of a view after pondering it. This whole idea of uh, uh, logic and thinking through and reasoning something out. Uh, there's two big reasons why this doesn't work in terms of our spiritual life and in terms of our faith. And one is that almost no matter what, it's flawed. Our logic's not that good. There's always going to be some assumptions, some premises that we're starting with that will determine where we end up. And it's basically impossible for us to drop those or to skirt around them, even if we know they're there. There's all this research about cognitive bias. Even if we know about a cognitive bias that we have, we can't not fall prey to it. And there's all kinds of fallacies. Fallacies. There's probably 100. So many different kinds of fallacies, informal fallacies, formal fallacies in our reasoning. Statistic fallacies, relevance fallacies, overgeneralized, on and on and on and on. So many fallacies. Propositional, um, yeah, improper premise, on and on and on. That's one reason. And the second reason is because of what the Buddha is teaching us about reality, about the Dhamma, about nature, about reality. And that is that it's not what we think it is. And in fact, it's dramatically different. And we can't think our way there. because of our delusion. We have to we have to penetrate. We have to have deep stillness of mind that becomes penetrative. Um, Otherwise, we will never arrive at the truth, um, ever. And then the third group is this, competence of a speaker, or because you think the aesthetic is our guru. And this is another huge propensity in the human mind that the Buddha talks a lot about. That we're prone to we we want something certain. We want something certain, and very often we will defer. Will just so and so said, and there are whole religions based on uh, an abdication, a giving over, a devotion to a guru. The Buddha is saying, don't do this. It's problematic. It's dangerous. You know. And this is quite similar to the first category about scripture. It's that, like, just verbatim getting told what to think, told what to do. And there is a propensity for all of us that it's easier. This is how cults come to be. Because and I saw Patty Hearst. This is a tangential, interviewed, um, uh, and people might very well not know who she is, but this whole idea of the mind control and the fragility of the mind. And she got asked, what, because she was kidnapped. She was a very rich child of a very, very rich family. This was maybe in the 60s or 70s. She was kidnapped and then kept for a very, very long time, and then months, and then was involved in a robbery with her captors. And then she was convicted. And finally, there was a whole movement. It's called the Stockholm Syndrome, a whole understanding in psychology that she, like the law should say, she was not in her right mind because and she got asked by this interviewer. Later, finally, she got um, released. It came to be understood what had happened to her. This mind control. We're so susceptible, so susceptible. She's asked, "What would you say to someone who still feels like you actually were guilty? You were the one holding the gun during this armed robbery." And she's got so much wisdom and peace and calm. And she just closes her eyes slowly and opens them up and says, I would say that person just doesn't understand the fragility of the human mind. How susceptible we all are. We think we're not, but we are. Every single one of us. So now the Buddha says what to do. And this is how we can figure out what to base our lives on and what to base our thinking and our understanding on. But when, Kalamas, you know for yourselves, these things are wholesome, these things are blameworthy, these things are censored by the wise, these things, if accepted and undertaken, lead to harm and suffering, then you should abandon them. And then he breaks it down. Like, so he starts with this overarching category of unwholesome, like things that cause suffering, things that cause complication and harm. And then he breaks it down. What do you think, Kalamas, when greed arises in a person? Is it for their welfare or their harm? And it's for their harm. And then he breaks it down even further. What does someone that overcome by greed, what does that look like? This is what it looks like. Kalamas, a greedy person overcome by greed with mind obsessed by it, destroys life, takes what is not given, transgresses with another's partner, and speaks falsehood. And they encourage others to do likewise. And will that lead to their harm and suffering for a long time? Yes. Yeah. So, and then he goes on and talks about ill will, and then he goes on and talks about delusion, you know, muddle-minded, confusion in the mind. These three very problematic forces in the human mind, and what each one leads to is us not keeping the four moral principles that the Buddha lays out. We're always used to hearing them as five precepts, and they are. There are five precepts that the Buddha gives. And the first four are moral, ethical, in and of themselves. And then the fifth precept is to not take intoxicants and drugs that cloud the mind. And the reason is because when we cloud the mind, our judgment, our restraint, our decision making is very compromised, and um, much more chance that we will break one of those four precepts of not taking life intentionally, not stealing, not taking people's possessions, not taking people's partners, and not speaking lies, not speaking falsehood. And in fact, in the United States, 80% of the offenses that lead to incarceration involve drugs and alcohol. You know, many of us probably can think about our own lives, that some of the worst things we've done, the worst decisions we've made, worst things we've said, perhaps, have involved drinking and drugs. So this is the advice that the Buddha gives, that um, we want to uh, we want to look at what we're doing, not what we're believing, not what ideas we have. What are we doing? It's all about morality and um, and having clarity about what is good, what is wholesome. And it's not about any kind of fear of punishment. It's based on an understanding of what, where is this going? What is this producing in my life, in my relationships, in my heart, in my conscience? It's individual, and this is what the Buddha is saying. When you know for yourselves, when you take a good look at your life, and it's so different. It's not um it's something that comes from deep inside. It's a deep understanding and conviction. These things are good. These things are beautiful. They're noble. They've got dignity. And um, it, this is the Buddha's appeal, that it's not at all about fear. It's not at all about punishment. It's not about guilt. It's about goodness, and it's about going in a good direction and knowing that for yourself. And that is one translation of this Pali word sadhu, a confidence that this is going in a good direction. That it's not like agreeing to this set of tenets and these ideas of this certain speaker, philosopher. It's looking at your own life, and you know um and we can do this like minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, week by week, month by month, what is this producing in my life? Where is this going? Where is this headed? This is what the Buddha is saying. And um, it, it, it's this opportunity, this invitation to actually become our own very best friend. That we're starting to do things slightly differently, deal with our greed and our ill will and our confusion slightly differently because just like, a really good friend would listen, they would understand, they would comfort, and they would support, us going in a good direction. We learn to do that for ourselves. And, so just to get specific, like last night we had a sutta contemplation online, and there was a woman there, and we were talking some about craving and uh, and we were talking about some other aspects of the Buddha's teachings and non-self, and she realized, oh, this craving isn't mine. And so she got really honest. She was like, um, she had a she had worked really hard, and it was the end of the day, and she was staying near a place that had fried chicken right next door, and she was had this craving and was gonna like treat herself, but knew that her particular digestive system, like, this is not a good idea, and it actually wouldn't be a treat. And this is one of the things I think that um, where craving trips us up over and over and over again is this like little tiny short-term hit, you know? But when we understand the the five precepts, and when we understand the harm that our craving is producing in our own lives and how problematic it is, we can start to um, not believe it so much, not be hooked by it so much. And one trick is just to actually feel it. Like, oh, I've got this craving. And just that, like, just name it. Yeah, I've got a craving. And it can be, it can even be during a conversation. Oh, I have a craving to get the attention. I have a craving for, people to start paying attention to me. Lots of us have this, and we're not tracking it, and there's just this habit running. And then to realize once we start to see and feel our cravings, um, eh, eh, this is important. Our greed and our ill will and our delusion, not so much. Our greed and our ill will are really manifestations of our delusion. But our greed and our ill will are serving a function in our lives. And a lot of times our craving is there because there are some needs and maybe some unmet needs underneath the craving. And so when we can really start to understand and love ourselves and be like, oh, I think a big one in lay life is just this craving to have a break, craving to chill out, craving for downtime. And that was a huge one for me. And as a single mom, commuting, working full time, aging parents, I just sit on the couch and watch TV? Um, and to realize, oh, there's a need for nourishment, there's a need for relaxation, there's a need for feeling not burdened. And if we start to get in touch with the need, then we can start to meet that need in a way that actually meets it. And this is a wonderful aspect of our spiritual practice, a wonderful aspect. And with ill will, so with craving, a lot of times there's some needs. And if we could get in touch with what the needs are, um, that example in a conversation, just instead of just sometimes you can feel it with people, they just grab, grab it, like, oh yeah, that happened to me, and then they tell you about like, and you can feel it like, oh, um, but if we can get in touch with, oh, I just have such an impulse to tell my story, um, so what is that? Oh, Um, and for many of us, this goes back to quite young. Some of us to like our family systems, to some of us our elementary school, you know, um, and to be with that. Does this make sense? What I'm saying? Yeah, yeah. And with ill will, the 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 purpose of the what ill will is serving in our lives is protection. A lot of times our ill will come up because somehow we're feeling um, violated or misunderstood or invaded um, or taken advantage of or um, uh, um, blamed. These are a lot of the things that come at us that the ill will comes up. And so again, to to care for that ill will and be like, oh, so, oh, and this is what's so beautiful with the Buddha's teachings. We can learn to really understand what's going on in here. And then um, I can do something more skillful than just having my ill will, make me uh, pull back. And, I had a situation this week with my siblings and I got hurt and then uh, it was different because I spoke up. But then I said, and I know not to do that in the future, which was not mature, it was a little, um, if I could do it again, I would have not said that little part. But yeah, like learning to, oh, I don't need to just feel guilty that I've got ill will, and I don't need to just act out on this ill will. I can care for it and then come to understand it and learn from it, and then I can make a choice that is um, much more skillful and going to actually work. Usually our ill will, if we act from it makes things worse. So an amazing teaching from the Buddha. And just to circle back to this idea of the axial age, one of my favorite authors is Karen Armstrong, and she's written a book about the axial age. Let me get the title right. Yeah. It's called The Great Transformation: The World at the Time of Buddha, Socrates, Confucius, and Jeremiah. And, she's a very deep thinker, probably one of the world's greatest comparative religion scholars. And she takes all of these different movements that are happening at the same time during the world at the time of the Buddha and is able to draw these threads um, that are common. And it's all to do with ethics. It's all to do with morality. And it like the Buddha, where he's talking about, coming from non-greed and non-ill will and non-delusion, non-confusion. Uh, it's basically the golden rule, don't do to someone else what you wouldn't want done. And this is the basis of the five precepts. Don't take someone's life. You don't want anyone to take your life. You don't take anyone else's. You don't want anyone to take your stuff. You don't take other people's stuff. You don't want someone to mess with your partner. Don't mess with other people's partners. You don't want someone to lie to you. Don't lie. This is the reason. Yeah. And um, yeah, the Buddha has really told us, yeah, I was going to title the talk, what matters when navigating perplexing matters.
Andamayan Dhammakataya Sadhukaram Dadamase. Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
So we have some time if anyone